goes on at all. But they said they were friendly. We don't understand their language. They don't understand ours. He called them Indians because he believed he was in the East Indies. This time, Ferdinand and Isabella sent 17 of their ships with Columbus at the head. They got back the island of Hispaniola, and folk, they found every one of the crew that Columbus had left, every European was dead, killed by the Indians. We don't know the details. Like I say, these men that they left behind were bad people anyway. They might have tried stealing or fighting against the Indians, whatever. And some people believe that some Carib cannibals came up from South America. They would come up once in a while and steal some people in order to cannibalize them. But again, we don't know. But this led to 400 years of warfare between European and Indian. That simply hardly could be stopped. Now, sadly, Columbus was once looked on as a hero. There is a nation named after him, Colombia. The Latin Americans used to really honor Columbus's day. Today he is looked on as being one of the biggest mass murderers in all of history. You're free to decide for yourself.
I believe it.
Do you believe? He could not help the diseases that Europeans spread to India. Now, the Europeans spread smallpox and typhus and a few other diseases the Indians had no immunity to. I really don't believe that he could help that very much. But he is blamed for the spread of these diseases. Let's see, seemed like there were three of them, but the two main ones were smallpox and typhus, typhoid fever that killed a lot of people. Typhoid fever was a big problem even 100 years ago. My grandma Cunningham died of typhoid fever in 1926. Wilbur Wright died of typhoid fever in 1916. Wilbur Wright invented the airplane. 1916. It's killed a lot of people up until they finally found a vaccination against it. But again, I can't say that I blame Columbus, because he did not know his men were carrying these diseases. He did not know that the Indians had no immunity to them, whatever. And keep in mind, it appeared to him the Indians drew the first blood. The long war between European and Indian actually stopped when the Indians stopped fighting. All right. Again, I'll get back with Columbus in a little bit, but we'll move on to Cortez. Cortez was on one of Columbus's voyages. Columbus was to make 4 voyages to the New World, they called it. Eventually, now we don't know, Columbus might have died without realizing he discovered a new world. That he always thought he was in the Indies. I mean, he visited Jamaica, he bumped into South America once. He visited several islands. He never touched what is today the United States. But in the meantime, there are some people who have the gift of learning a foreign language. And Cortez found a woman one day, an Indian woman, who could pick up on the Spanish language really quickly, and she had learned several Indian languages. This woman was able to speak the language of the Aztecs. The Aztecs were a civilized group of Indians. All right. I say that word civilized tongue-in-cheek, but nevertheless, they had a civil government. What do I mean by civilized? It means they had diversity of occupation. One person did this job, another person did that job. They had a government. They had armies. They had religion. They had courts. So that's what we define as civilization. In other words, more than one tribe, but a whole nation of people. The Aztecs were civilized, and Cortez met them. When Cortez initially met the Aztecs, The Aztecs offered a human sacrifice to the Spaniards, believing the Spaniards were gods. All this did was sicken the Spaniards. I'm skipping a lot of the story. Eventually, Cortez reached the capital in what is today Mexico City, and he heard a bunch of screams, hideous, horrible screams from the temple. So he asked his interpreter what these screams were about. And he interpreted, oh, these are people who are being offered a sacrifice to Quetzalcoatl, the sun god. Cortez turned to Montezuma and said, your gods are not gods, but devils. Well, there was a tense moment between Montezuma's men and Cortez's men, but peacekeepers came in on both sides and kind of temporarily smoothed things over. I always ask every class I teach folk, what would you have done if you had been there and heard the hideous screams coming from the temple and been told that these were being offered to their God?
I'd be pretty disgusted, I guess.
Be pretty disgusted. Folk, I cannot blame Cortez. Now, keep in mind, Cortez does not know about political correctness, and political correctness does not really answer this kind of question. Cortez put a stop to it. He moved in with only 200 men he had. Now, oh yes, Cortez did something Julius Caesar had done about 2,000 years earlier. Julius Caesar burned his bridges behind him and said, we're either going to conquer Rome or die doing it. And Cortez landed, he burned his ships and said, we're either going to conquer this land or we're going to die doing it. Cortez collected as many Indians as he could, and a lot of the Indians, tens of thousands of Indians sided with Cortez because Montezuma's tax collectors would go around the land and they would take any pretty woman they wanted to as a sex slave. You know, they didn't just collect taxes. I mean, they collected human trafficking. And this was all done with Cortez's full knowledge and approval. So Cortez had an easy time collecting a bunch of Indians to rebel against Montezuma. Also, Cortez was looked on as a god. Cortez had horses, and the horses were looked on as being one person with 2 heads and 6 legs, 2 human legs and 4 horse legs. But the Indians thought of him as one person. Half of Montezuma's army refused to fight. They said, we can't fight against gods. And then with the diseases that Cortez's men spread among the Indians, all that combined helped Cortez to win. He conquered Montezuma, destroyed the Aztecs, stopped the human sacrifice. Believing his religion was superior, he tried forced conversions, which did not work out very well. You can condemn it, folk. And I had a student write a report one time that said, when you look at the morality of Cortez and Montezuma, it's difficult to tell which one of them was more moral than the other. They both sides were morally bankrupt. I mean, I gotta say, it reminds me of the last presidential election. It was difficult to decide which of the 2 main candidates was more immoral than the other one. Maybe you don't think so, but I do. And you had to choose somehow. All right, anyway, the Europeans won. Just like the Europeans were to win the conflict from there on out. There was another group of civilized people who lived farther south, the Incas. Pizarro crossed the Isthmus of Panama. Actually, Balboa had sent you further. Pizarro was one of the men, but Balboa was shot dead by an Indian arrow, or died. And Pizarro took command. He met the Incas. He conquered the Incas. The Incas had a lot of gold. I mean, tons of it, and nobody knows where that gold came from. Nobody. But the Spanish took the gold, took it back to Spain, and all of a sudden Europe's gold shortage was solved. Now, Europe had had a gold shortage ever since the days of the Roman Empire, when Romans would buy silk from the Chinese. And to this day, Roman coins are found in Vietnam, China, Japan. The gold went one way and never came back to Europe. Yes?
Why did they, I know they conquered the Aztecs to try to stop the sacrifice, but were they just continuing with the Incas, or was there another reason they wanted to conquer?
The Incas also, I didn't mention, the Incas also practiced human sacrifice, as did the Maya. Now, in the case of the Mayan civilization was already pretty well shot up and declined before the Europeans arrived. And I've been reading about what happened to Maya. The Maya somehow depopulated. But we're finding the Maya buildings deep, deep into the dense, dense forest, where it's almost impossible to get to. I mean, it's so the jungle is so thick you stick out your hand and can't even see your hand. And but we're using penetrating radar to penetrate the undergrowth of the forest and find that it's filled with all kinds of buildings that the Maya constructed. Yes. By the way, about the papers, I'm not going to ask you to do the same assignment because I felt like in the long run it benefited nobody but me. It taught me what you young people are thinking, what you've been taught. But you pick out your topic. There is a paper assigned, 1,000 words. Pick your topic. You do not have to turn your topic into me. The papers are turned in on iCollege. The instructions are on the syllabus. All right. Anyway, Cortez conquered the Aztecs. Pizarro conquered the Incas. And gold found its way back to Europe. This gold was used in Spain, but it led to inflation in Spain. Prices in Spain became higher and higher. The Spanish people found out they could buy their goods from other countries cheaper. So this gold from Spain found its way to other countries. And 2 kings in a row of Spain went bankrupt. King Philip II and his son by name. A couple of inventions that helped Europeans spread the globe. There was the compass and astrolabe. Now, I had a brother who was in the army one time, and he tried to navigate by compass on a highway. You cannot navigate on a highway by compass, folks. On a highway, you've got to go before the road's going. And again, today, I navigate a lot, and I'm going to unfamiliar if I navigate with GPS. And I think all of you know the GPS can be wrong. Yes. They'll lead you off of a road for a few miles, and then lead you back on the road it just got you off of. But one GPS told my son to turn into a one-way street. He did and hit another car head on. Nobody was hurt, but fortunately they weren't going very fast. This had happened to me one time. I had the same thing. I didn't hit another car. If there would have been one there, I'd have hit it. The GPS told me to turn into a one-way street the wrong way. I don't know how many of you is, but GPSs are great and wonderful, but they're not foolproof. And there's a rumor going around that the Russians are trying to hack into our GPSs and confuse all of us. This story is told. I don't know how true it is. There's also rumors going around that the Russians fixed our last election. I'm not going to tell you how much money they paid me. A friend of mine told me that they said, we know this about you and we're going to tell your wife if you don't go. Okay, you know. No. Anyway. All right. The astrolabe, that is a device that tells you what latitude you're on the globe and your longitude. It tells you in position relative to the sun. Again, the compass has a needle. Now, the compass needle does not always point true north. Especially since the north magnetic pole is not, the north magnetic on a compass is not right at the north on the North Pole, the actual North Pole. But anyway, compasses, they're good for navigating in the open ocean or even for airplanes. All right. Anyway, Spain began to colonize the New World. They mined for gold and silver. The mercantile system was set up. Now, when I was in high school, I was assigned to do mercantile, and by the time I was done, I knew no more about it than I had. But basically, mercantile is you have a mother country and a colony. The mercantile system is arranged to benefit the mother country at the expense of the colony. Now, this is going to become very important in our history because one time the United States was a colony of Great Britain, and Great Britain passed a bunch of trade laws that benefited Great Britain at the expense of the colonies, and the colonies rebelled. This is, hopefully all of you know that Great Britain once had 13 colonies in North America, and Georgia is one of the colonies, one of the original 13. Oh, yes. And Great Britain lost them. But anyway, the mercantile system, mother country, colony, and they set up trade to where the colony can only trade with the mother country, and it trades in such a way that it leaches them, the colony, and greatly benefits the mother country. All right. Now, other European nations finally got involved. Among the British, and oh yes, when I checked around the room, they did not have any eraser. Okay, among the British, there was John Cabot. John Cabot went to a country which he called Newfoundland, or has still got the name Newfoundland. John Cabot found a whole bunch of cod that the cod has somehow disappeared. But anyway, he founded the country of Newfoundland. It's today part of Canada. And eventually the British claimed almost all of what is today North America. Spain got Florida. I mean, again, I could spend the whole day talking about Spanish exploration, but a Spanish explorer named Ponce de Leon went to Florida. So did Hernando de Soto. You might have you'll run into those names if you study American history, but we have to leave a lot out. But Cabot crossed the Atlantic, came back and reported what he'd seen. Cabot went out again and disappeared, has not been seen from that day to this. When the New World was divided up, the Pope divided, he used the line of demarcation. Line of demarcation in which he divided the New World between Spain and Portugal. I had a pupil once tell me that was trivia, but it isn't really. The line of demarcation put Brazil on the Portuguese side of the line and Africa. In other words, Portugal got Brazil and Africa, and Spain got what was west of the line. Now, that's why most of the western places in Latin America speak Spanish. I'm talking about Chile, Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay, Ecuador, Bolivia, and in Mexico. They speak Spanish. Go to Brazil and they speak Portuguese. Yes?
Professor, so you said the Pope divided the New World between Portugal and
Spain. Portugal and Spain, yeah. But the King of France said, who's the Pope to give the whole world to Spain and Portugal? And he decided he would take some himself. But anyway, the line of demarcation gave the New World discoveries, and Africa was included. Africa was going to point out Portugal was too small to hold on to as a lot of Africa. Now, as recently as when I was a kid in school, the textbook said Portugal still had a few places in Africa. Today, they've had to give them all up. Colonialism became really, really unpopular after World War II. But colonialism was the order of the day, was to be the order of the day throughout the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, until the late 1800s. The United States even got involved during the Spanish-American War in taking over some nations. Puerto Rico, we still have today, along with the Virgin Islands and Samoa. Oh yeah, you can plug in. Now, the French wound up taking over most of Canada. Yes?
Is the line of demarcation also called the Tordesillas demarcation line?
I'm not certain of that. I'd have to look that up. What's that? How do you spell that word again?
Tordesillas. I was just looking at it.
I'm not sure of that. I've always known of it as a line of demarcation. Even Holland got involved. The Dutch, that's the thing for the people from Holland. The Dutch wound up in New Amsterdam, what is today New York. A Dutchman named Peter Minuit bought Long Island from the Indians for a few trinkets, a few hatchets, and a few little pieces of jewelry. But the Dutch wound up, they could not hold New Amsterdam, so the English took it over and called it New York after the Duke of York, who took the land. But again, all this you read into if you've studied American history. The English wound up colonizing much of the Atlantic seaboard. There were several unsuccessful attempts by the English to colonize, the most famous being a colony in Roanoke, North Carolina, where a baby was born named Virginia Dare. The leader of the colony went back to England, came back and found that the colony had disappeared. I have read about that, but I'm not going to go into detail about it now. But there are persons who believe the colony wound up deep inside the Appalachian Mountains to hide from the Indians. But we don't know what happened to the colony. But anyway, in 1607, Jamestown, Virginia was founded, and that was the first English settlement that lasted. Now, there were some settlements that are old Jamestown, but they're Spanish. New Mexico had a settlement before Jamestown, and St. Augustine, Florida got started in 1590, 17 years before Jamestown. But St. Augustine was Spanish. Now, Florida was Spanish, and the western part of what's the United States, I'm talking about Texas and California and New Mexico and Arizona, Utah, Colorado, they were owned by the Spanish. And of course, Mexico itself. They were Spanish. All right, and the English got much of the Atlantic seaboard from Maine, what is today Maine, to Georgia. The English did not get Florida during this time period. In fact, the English never got Florida. We purchased Florida from Spain in 1819. Africa, there was a lot of gold found in Africa also. There was a lot of ivory. Today, the practice of getting ivory has been outlawed. But also, Africa supplied much of the New World with slaves. The Portuguese were the original slave traders. They traded in slaves first, and they were the last to quit, regrettably. After the rest of the nations, even the United States, outlawed the slave trade, Portuguese were still carrying it on. The United States and Great Britain tried to patrol the waters to keep the Portuguese out. You notice that the United States and Great Britain, the United States dragged its feet about it. Great Britain tried hard to stop the Portuguese, but the United States dragged its feet. Now, this was before the Civil War. But eventually, Portugal was persuaded to stop dealing in slaves. Slavery was to become a problem. Well, actually, it's been a problem in Africa from the very earliest of history until today. There are rumors that in the Congo and in what it once was the Sudan, slavery still goes on. Slavery has never stopped in Africa. Corn came from the Americas. Now, I will say this, corn is one of the least nutritious foods there is, but it's fairly easy to grow. If you like it, go ahead and eat it. I do, but it's one of the least nutritious foods you can eat. Corn flakes, seriously lacking in vitamins and minerals. But I eat it myself sometimes. Not all the time, I mean, but anyway, coffee came from the New World. Potatoes, oh yes, potato came from the New World. Potatoes, corn, coffee, sugar. Now, sugar did not come from the New World. Potato. Sugar was not originally grown in the New World, but a lot of sugar was made in the New World, and tobacco. These products the New World gave the Old: tobacco, sugar, coffee, corn, potatoes, squash. Then the turkey, a New World animal. These were foods that the New World gave to the Old. Slowly, North and South America were becoming Europeanized. All right, moving from there, Southeast Asia. Most of you might be familiar with the changes that the arrival of the Europeans made in the New World, but the arrival of the Europeans greatly changed Southeast Asia also. I mentioned already how that nobody would have guessed that these dirty, ragged, scurvy crewmen who land in India would lead the way and change so much of what was going on in the Far East. But the Europeans discovered that their equipment and their weapons were better than the weapons they found in these countries. Particularly, Europeans developed a better cannon that could shoot farther than Muslim cannon could. Better gunpowder that could shoot better than Muslim gunpowder could. And then they made better rifles that were better than the rifles Muslims had, and better than anything the Chinese had or the Far Eastern peoples had. And this gave Europeans an advantage. And we're later going to learn that a big technological revolution occurred that again gave the Europeans an advantage. In Southeast Asia, two religions were dominant: Islam and Buddhism. Buddhism had started out in India, but it traveled to Southeast Asia, and it was embraced by a lot of the Southeast Asians because it appeared to be superior to their own religion. And Islam also made a lot of headway in what is today Indonesia. But the Islamic world at this time fell behind the Christian world. These people, their economy was based largely on agriculture. They grew a lot of rice, which they exported. They also exported nuts, ceramics. One thing that helped both the spread of Islam and Buddhism was in Southeast Asia, they were egalitarian. Much like the American Indians.